So this is work that comes out of my dissertation, which is now 4 years old. I'm still trying to find the right home for this, so I'd welcome any kinds of ideas that you all have about how to frame this. There's certainly a theoretical piece here that I'm not going to sort of be able to sort of get into here, but I really want to kind of focus on sort of the methodological contribution here and kind of provoke you in that space. So the work I'm going to be talking about is around networks, and so when we think about networks, we often think of diagrams like this, where you would have what I'll call like nodes. This isn't actually going to point at anything. I'm going to point my fingers. So I'm going to use like the terms like nodes or vertices, which are these kinds of red things. And then we've got like edges or connections or relationships, which are these black things. In this case, it's directed. So A is connected to B, is connected to C, is connected to A. So we might call a pattern like that transitivity, or we might call something like that reciprocity. And so we look at how these kinds of local level dyadic patterns, oftentimes in network science, we look at how these local level kinds of dyadic interaction patterns aggregate to sorts of large hairball looking diagrams like this. And we try to understand and kind of develop quantitative features that describe these large scale graphs like this. And so this is just a little bit of kind of vocab to kind of do some level setting for everyone in the audience if you don't come from a network science background. But the relationships that we examine in networks are often things that we are agentic and conscious and things like that. So like communication, who talks to whom, things like information networks, like documents linked to other documents through hyperlinks, or it might be exchange networks, in which case people are providing goods or services in exchange for other goods and services. And we also, in network science and social network analysis more generally, look at organizational affiliation, so who's parts of which teams or groups and organizations. But in this talk, I want to kind of problematize or try to potentially look at alternative kinds of relationships that we might see, in particular in socio-technical systems. And I'm going to call these socio-technical trajectories. This maybe is sort of more heat than light, but hopefully we can maybe come up with a better name as well. And the argument I'm going to make is that these socio-technical trajectories have four properties. They illuminate the accumulation of contributions, have these non-random structures in these systems, and that this allows us to understand these emergent properties to support mixed methods inquiry in the social sciences and information sciences generally. And so I want to accent on this idea of this accumulation in this first part here. And so when we think about or theorize about how socio-technical systems work, how things like Wikipedia or Linux or free open source software, all these systems work, Eric S. Raymond was a hacker and a sort of a folk theorist of how these systems might work. He makes the case for there being two models about how you might do sort of complex coordination work in these kinds of information systems. And so trying to understand how it is that you've got like a software system like Linux is developed by a corporation, or like Linux is developed by an open source community. How is it able to sort of manage the complexities of that in the face of all these coordination challenges by adopting a very different kind of organizational model than something like Windows, which is developed by a corporation, which incentivizes software engineers to produce things and have managerial structures to manage all these kinds of processes. The Linux community doesn't have that. And so he appeals to this idea of like cathedrals and bazaars, so that something like Windows or Microsoft works like a cathedral. Important software needs to be built like a cathedral. But we see this kind of alternative, like this great babbling bazaar kind of emerging as an alternative to this mode of production for these complex software systems. And it seems that the bazaar would not be well equipped to handle this, and yet we have this kind of evidential proof that it works, because we've got an existence proof that this thing exists in the world, so and it's generated by this process. So at the boundaries, it must at least kind of work. So this has been a sort of very persuasive in lots of kinds of information science circles and things like that. Unfortunately, Eric never went and talked to a historian of architecture to understand how cathedrals are built. So if you went and talked to a historian of architecture to understand how cathedrals are built, they would say something like, this cathedral in France was actually built over the period of several decades, 30 distinct campaigns. There was no kind of centralized designer coordinating everything. There's no centralized plan. You have this succession of builders. So this idea that the work of creating this kind of very complex, large-scale artifact was, in fact, the cathedral itself was also an accumulation of the work of many men working in this very kind of distributed fashion. So even the cathedral model is actually kind of very distributed. But this points to like the need to kind of understand these processes of accumulation, right? So like how is it that these accumulative processes work in these kinds of systems? And so when we fast forward the tape to understand, when Yochai Benkler talks about peer production systems, he talks about the need to pool diverse efforts. in these modular projects and fine-grained contributions. You talk to Clay Shirky, he says creating these systems is like creating a coral reef, the sum of these millions of individual actions. So again, this idea of this accumulative processes is sort of very important to understanding how coordination works to create these complex socio-technical artifacts. And so what I want to argue methodologically we need is to begin to sort of look into these accumulation processes, to begin to understand sorts of the structures and the dynamics simultaneously that are occurring within these kinds of accumulative processes. So this trajectory approach that I'm going to walk through in a second is a method. It's going to identify these overlooked relationships that exist in many kinds of these systems. In particular, looking at these event log sequences, like sequential actions that occur in event logs. And one way we begin to sort of interrogate the structure of these is using network analysis approaches. So what do I mean by an event log sequence? And so if you look at something like Wikipedia, has a record of every single change that's been made to Wikipedia over time, right? So we've got, you can go back to the very 2001, you can look at every single change that's been made to Wikipedia since 2001. So you could go look at the Hillary Clinton article and how she was described, by Wikipedia in this community in 2001, and compare that to 2008 and compare that to 2016, for example. But you can look at every single change that's been made, and it's time-stamped, and people leave comments, and you can kind of click on the link, and you can look at the state of the article at that point in time. But many systems have this kind of affordance, right? If you go to like GitHub repositories or any kind of distributed version control system, has a similar kind of affordance where you can go through and look at every single change that's been made to this platform. You can also think moving away from kinds of these production-oriented sorts of systems to sorts of more community-oriented systems. You might think of a whole discussion thread as sort of representing the accumulation of contributions to that, in which case like every person's comment on a discussion thread is a kind of contribution that's we can look at as a sequence of events. And so more generally, we might step back and think of an event log as containing these four kind of distinct features: an activity, someone making a commit or revision or a comment; a case, something that's being acted on, so in this case a Wikipedia article or a discussion thread or code repository; someone who's executing that action, a user, an editor, a member of that community; and then really crucially is there's an order. We've got this index defining a sequence over which these events are occurring. So this is a timestamp, this is a position, it's kind of a relative sort of index like that. So abstractly we might represent this as, that we've got, Wikipedia article X, and then this sequence of 4 users, A, B, C, and D, making commits to this article at different points in time. And so the way that we might traditionally interrogate how these kinds of software platforms and systems work from a network analysis kind of method, and there's a large literature on how you might go about doing this, would be to sort of ask this kind of question about bipartite graphs, like which users are contributing to which artifacts, who's editing what, and maybe how that changes over time. And that might produce like an image like this, in which case, if I take all of the articles in Wikipedia about current events, which is the focus of my dissertation, in 2011, all these red nodes are articles, and all these little blue dots are the editors who contribute to them. So you get this kind of nice picture of a collaboration where we've got like articles about the Japanese earthquake, or the article about the killing of Osama bin Laden, and so you've got all these different kinds of articles, and they're all indirectly connected through editors working across multiple articles to fashion this kind of larger collaboration, to create this giant component. But we don't really have a way of kind of zooming in and understanding what's happening in any particular article, right? And so the way we might kind of understand how that collaboration unfolds over time is we might say, like at time 1, A edits X, at time 2, B edits X, and so on. We might sort of represent that there might be some variation in terms of the intensity of this collaboration, the fact that A is editing 3 times by kind of incrementing that edge weight, so that A is a thicker bar. But this is also somewhat unsatisfying because, again, if we wanted to understand what's going on within a single article, this kind of methodological approach would really only kind of reveal the article and the people who edited it, and we don't have any kind of interesting variation going on in terms of what's going on within an article and the editor's interactions within that. And so the kind of relationship I want to extract and explore here is to look at this and draw on sorts of approaches from sociology and operations research and things like that. And so thinking about sequence analysis and narrative networks and event log and kinds of approaches. And to ask this question of who modifies whose work. So the fact that user B edits after user A, so user A or user B is user A is in some way sort of transferring the work, the contribution, the state of the article to the next user, to user B, right? And so substantively what this might look like in this kind of context like Wikipedia is you might have at this point in time in 2013, the state of the article looked like this, and there was this kind of part of the article where this is all capitalized. And this is not to say that this person was responsible for this edit, only that this person had edited the article. That was the state of the article at the time that person made that contribution. Then at a later point in time, that state of the article shifted and another change was made to that state of the article. And in this case, they kind of like decapitalized those letters. So this is a fairly kind of microscopic, non-substantive kind of contribution. But how might we begin to sort of aggregate this up and begin to understand the accumulation of all these contributions in creating kind of really complex and interesting artifacts? You could look at this in like GitHub or something like that. All right, so so what's the method, Brian? So again, we could take the same kind of event log, right? And we can now represent sort of the sequence of people performing these actions. So again, we take B editing after A, C editing after B, and so on. So we can take advantage of this temporal sequencing to look at people editing in the sequence. Well, again, we've got this issue of this repeated A person coming in there. And so we might represent this instead as a graph where, A creates the article, is the first editor on the article, B edits afterwards, C edits after B. A jumps in again and edits after C. And so all of a sudden, you got this really interesting kind of transitive kind of property emerging. And so this really interesting kind of complexity. This fourth editor comes along, D comes in, and A edits a third time for the sixth revision and creates this nice kind of reciprocated link there. And so again, I want to emphasize that we're capturing substantively very different kinds of relationships here. That we've got the traditional modality, how we would understand sorts of collaborations in these systems would be to say like, who edits what. Instead, what we're looking at, and what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk, are these temporal adjacencies, the fact that someone edits after someone else. And you're going to have three immediate objections to like this approach. It's like, I can't control who edits after me. Like I'm fundamentally violating a very basic assumption of a lot of social network analysis to say that the ways in which I have agency in who I choose to be friends with or who I choose to engage in economic trade or communicate with, and the fact that someone edits after me, I have no sort of agency or choice in that. This seems to violate a really kind of fundamental assumption of a lot of approaches to sort of understanding social relations. These systems and these event logs include lots of vandalism and minor changes. We're including lots of these tiny little changes. Why should we care or pay any attention to these tiny little changes? Should we really just be looking for people who are doing sort of the substantive, important, real kind of work? Why should we care about these little people and small things? And then finally, the fact that I edit after each other doesn't really kind of capture the fact that we're substantively working or coordinating with each other. Maybe I'm working on the second paragraph in the article and Joe's working on the 12th paragraph. The fact that we edit after each other is maybe perhaps purely coincidental, and this is a very naive assumption. And so we'll address each of those in turn. So again, working up this kind of approach to kind of understand this accumulation of contributions. The rest of the talk will be structured around kind of illuminating each of these in turn. For the next part, we'll look at sort of these accumulation processes, right? So if you wanted to take an article like this, so this is the article about the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011. So this is the state of the article. This is a very complex article. This is what it looked like about a month after the earthquake and tsunami had happened, right? This is only like the first introductory kind of paragraph. You've got this kind of extremely, you've got this, this doesn't point. You've got all this kind of like really nice metadata over here, and so someone's taken the time to kind of create this template and organize all this really important kind of high-level data as a summary sort of statistics. Includes geographic coordinates, includes references, includes like up-to-date numbers about like the deaths, as well as sorts of like very kinds of strange physical things about what was the peak acceleration of the earthquake of 2.99 Gs. Includes like kanji kinds of characters here. We've got hyperlinks to all the different other kinds of articles, Wikipedia, references to all these. And so all this work of coordinating this and introducing all this really complex work is obviously this great kind of contribution that Wikipedia can make. And the fact that they can do this really quickly and create this high-value artifact, this high-quality artifact, is very valuable. And so you might look at the event log for this article. Here, this is kind of the first changes that were made to the article here. And what would using this socio-technical graph approach, should we create like a nice hairball like this, where again the nodes are editors, and editors are connected to other editors if they're editing one after another, right? So we're going to walk through this graph in a little bit. And so this graph has some like really interesting sort of non-random properties, right? We've got sort of like bigger nodes because they have more connections to other people. We've got clustering. We've also kind of got sorts of these weird loop things going on. But if you've looked at like network hairball visualizations before, this kind of like generally looks kind of you've got sort of, this is a sparse graph, but it still has clustering. It's not completely connected. We've got some interesting variation in terms of connectivity and things like that as well. And so this non-random structure, so I would argue that this graph, in fact, is a non-random structure. Like many complex networks, has these long-tailed degree distributions where most nodes have very low connectivity, but there's a handful of nodes that have very high connectivity, which is to say that most nodes are only connected to one other editor, but there's a handful of nodes out here in the long tail that are connected to hundreds of other editors. And you might say, well, what if it was just like a random process that was generating this network, right? So we could come up with a distribution of random networks that have the same number of nodes, the same density of the graph, and we could look at other features of that graph and what would that look like. So the graph that I showed you are those features are here in red. And then if we generated a distribution of 100 random networks with the same density and same size, we form these distributions down here in blue. And again, we see that the network I showed you before is in fact significantly different from the random networks in terms of the connectivity, the amount of reciprocity, the amount of clustering, and how kind of wide the network is, how far apart are the two farthest apart nodes. And so again, this is just to show that like this if I adopt this method and I apply it to this kind of sequence analysis about this very kind of interesting Wikipedia article, the resulting graph is in fact not have the same properties as of a network that was generated by a random process. And so we could look at other articles than just like an article about a single earthquake or something like that. We might look at a whole set of articles on Wikipedia about different kinds of events. In this case, these are airline crashes. So these are airline crashes. So all four of these are using this method applied to articles about airline crashes. The top two we kind of, again, qualitatively recognize as being kind of having this hairball-y quality, again, clustering, kind of short path lengths, relatively sparse. And then down here, we've got, these don't look like normal kinds of complex networks, right? That these are kind of, have this kind of spaghetti-like pattern rather than the hairball pattern, right? So we've got like spaghetti down here and hairball up here. And so there's a qualitative difference between like applying this method to similar kinds of data generates very different kinds. We've got very interesting sort of variation in these network patterns here. So I'll just apply this kind of general feature name of hairballiness. So these graphs up here I'm going to assert are more hairbally than these graphs down here are less hairbally. And so we might ask that if we looked at like a distribution of articles about medicine. So if we looked at all the 2,000 articles in Wikipedia that are classified about being medicine, and these are reviewed by different kinds of quality metrics. So C is a very kind of low quality. This is the most kind of prevalent classification of article in Wikipedia. B are like kind of okay articles. They got some references and links to other kinds of things, but they're not great. These two, like the good articles and the featured articles, go through different levels of peer review. So good articles go through like a preliminary process of peer review by Wikipedians for quality, different kinds of quality checks for references and images and links to other content in Wikipedia. And then featured articles go through an extremely stringent peer review process, right? So there's a continuum of low to high kinds of quality articles here. Then I'm measuring, again, is this one feature we can measure here is clustering, but again, sort of higher clustering is more hairbally, lower clustering is lower quality. But again, we're kind of capturing here, when we construct networks using this method, and we extract one feature like clustering, we see that higher quality articles, in fact, have more hairballiness characteristics. We can look at reciprocity again. Higher quality articles have significantly higher hairballiness. And if we look at the path lengths, higher quality articles, especially featured articles in particular, have significantly higher hairballiness, right? So we're capturing something about the quality of, by looking at these kinds of collaborations in this approach, the fact that people are editing after one another, the sequences and the structures that emerge from these sequences of actions are actually have these really interesting correlations with quality. That somehow quality is being implicated in the way that people coordinate with each other, right? And so this objection that you can't control after me, in fact, we see that when we look at all these different network properties about like centralization and so on, we apply this method, we see that like rather than these being generated by sorts of random properties, that in fact that these graphs have sort of very non-random properties compared to random graphs of similar size and density. We see that there's these interesting correlations with quality when we look at sorts of graphs being generated by this. We see this variation in quality in higher level articles. Higher quality articles have the sequences are capturing something around that. And so I would argue that, in fact, that these are in fact not random, but it's capturing something about people's and actors' ability to sort of monitor other people's engagement with this, and they're deciding when and how, after someone else edits, they're choosing to engage at particular points in time with other people's contributions immediately afterwards. And so what are some other kinds of interesting emergent properties, right? So we're capturing also this interesting kind of temporal dimension in this as well. So the fact that someone edits after another, like this edge is occurring at some kind of latency. It might be a few seconds, it might be a few hours, it might be a few days or weeks. So we can look at like how much time has elapsed from like one editor making a contribution to another. We can also look at the size of the contribution, like did editor B add a lot more content? We could also look at kinds of the features that are like, are they adding links or removing content or adding bad words or anything like that? So we can begin to bring in all this really rich content metadata as well. So if we go back to this hairball that I had before, I've colored the nodes here now from this blue to red spectrum. So where blue are people who joined the collaboration earlier on in the article's history. So blue are people who made their first contribution to the article very close to when the article was created. People in red, these users out here in red, are people who joined the article weeks after the article was created, made their first contribution weeks afterwards. And so we've got this kind of initial cluster of first editors, and so what this is telling us that we've got the initial editors come, they make the first contributions to this article, they're very motivated to edit this article. In fact, this article was created 33 minutes after the earthquake happened, so you could potentially have read about this earthquake on Wikipedia before the tsunami came ashore in some parts of Japan. The Japanese article was actually created 9 minutes after the earthquake ended. And so this is a very sort of fast response. And so we've got this kind of group of ambulance chasers here who are just very engaged in sort of current events and writing these articles about these events and responding to them very quickly. But again, they are sort of not central to this approach, right? They're kind of out here in the margins. They're editing each other's work, but they're not editing the work. They're not kind of they're not implicated in this kind of core of very involved contributors, right? So these are people who come a little bit later. They're blue. They're engaged very early on. They're closely modifying each other's work in these kind of very early stages of the article, building on each other's work. Then out here, we got these weird loopy things with this periphery of these ephemeral editors. And again, this is a pattern of people making a contribution, and then someone else comes and puts something on top of their contribution, and so on. And like none of the rest of this whole collaboration is engaging at all. All these people have left, right? The fact that these people are making contributions on top of each other and no one else in these thousands of editors is engaging with those contributions suggests a very kind of qualitative shift in how this kind of collaboration has unfolded over time, right? And so we got this very interesting person here who's very central, integrating everyone's editors, modifying the work. He's large, he's modifying the work in many other unique editors. He has a high degree of centrality. And then we've got this kind of interesting green person who's like surrounded by red people. This is actually not a person, it's a bot. This is a program that's like undoing vandalism. So the fact it's surrounded by these kinds of red nodes is like these vandals come and try to deface the page. This bot auto reverts it. So it's green because it came relatively early in the article, and then it's modifying the work of all these bad people. So we could color it by when they started editing. We can also color it when they stop editing. So again, this blue cluster, people came early, they left early. These blue people from before, they came early, but they actually stick around for a while. And then we got these two people here who came early and they stayed actually a really long time. They continued to edit weeks after the article was created. So we could begin to sort of bring in this really interesting kind of metadata and begin to think about sorts of processes of people interacting at different points in time. We can also kind of like condition the links on how quickly people are editing. So again, this early contributors, they're making revisions like within within seconds of each other, right? They're kind of making contributions one on top of each other, less than 60 seconds. A lot of the work in the rest of this article, all those links go away. These are kind of occurring in a much slower pace. You can look at people who are making actual like writing this sentence. And like all the really interesting stuff goes away. You've only got like a handful of people. So the people who actually write the sentences, who like make a larger contribution, are not the largest people. They're doing a very different kind of work. So we're kind of illuminating these kind of diversification of social roles. So the people who are actually writing substantive content are not the most central or best connected people here. Are actually relatively marginal. And so yeah, to this kind of objection that, well, this includes all these vandals and minor changes, right? You've got like all these people are doing all this work, but the people who like write a sentence are actually relatively marginal. So what is it that all these people are doing? And a lot of it is this anti-vandalism work and things like that. And so So vandalism is actually a really important input into this collaboration, right? It's an occasion for people to come together and collaborate, respond to each other's kinds of work, build upon each other's work, and recognize that this is something that other people are looking at. It is still valued by the community, and they want people to sort of maintain the quality of this article. And it allows people to kind of come in and adopt and sustain different kinds of social roles in the social system. And in fact, much of the work that goes on in Wikipedia articles isn't writing like substantive content, but is actually kind of doing the sort of this copy editing and synthesis kind of work rather than authoring new content. And so what this approach begins to illuminate is that there's particular contexts and consequences of people interacting with each other in different kinds of configurations, and this kind of manifests in different kinds of roles and structures using this approach. And so those are all kind of nice kind of quantitative stories, but I think what's most exciting about this approach is it lets us begin to sort of collapse and boil down this really kind of complex sequential data into, and begin to sort of identify anomalies and kind of interesting kinds of outliers that lets us kind of begin to sort of do case studies and do more kind of qualitative inquiry. And so you could also take my revision history, and so all of a sudden we could do the trajectory for myself, where now it's not all of the things that, so it's now all the articles I've edited and how I've moved through the space of editing Wikipedia articles, right? So we could do an event log, so I could take the event log for a user, and so in this case, one person, and then you can look at all the articles that they move through over time and use a similar kind of approach. So that really central person that I showed you before, this super central person here, so let's look at what he was doing before and after this collaboration, all right? So let's like zoom back out and think about like, well, what's the whole, everything that he was doing before and after, and does that tell us any stories about the nature of this person's motivations and social roles? And so we can look at the earliest articles that he edited. It was actually with the Tucson shooting with Gabby Giffords in 2011. And then he kind of like meanders off and starts editing these articles about like mobile phones and Antarctica and like spiders and things like that. And then all of a sudden he gets to like the article, the Japanese earthquake and tsunami article that happens, and he takes on a very different kind of role and kind of interaction pattern than he had before. So again, these blue nodes are like the main namespace articles. These are the articles that 99% of us read. These pink articles are the user talk pages. So he's going to other users and saying like, thanks for doing this work, or can we do some kind of like dispute resolution or something like that. These light blue articles are the talk pages for the article. So he's actually moving between the main article space and talk article space and trying to do consensus formation and things like that. They've got these brown articles down here, these really interesting kind of technical articles. So he's like moving between these very different kinds of spaces, engaged in very kinds of diverse kinds of work of talking to people, doing work on the article, and talking to other kinds of collaborators. And then he stops. This editor like worked without stopping for more than 60 minutes over a 56-hour period of time, which seemed to suggest it's probably more than one person who is operating this account, but an extremely active editor for an extremely prolonged period of time, and very important to this collaboration. Another important person, and if you begin to think about how like organizations like Wikipedia operate, and from like thinking about organizations and management, if someone came to you and said like, I edit Harry Potter and articles about Scotch, like, will you let me edit an article about Japanese nuclear disasters? Like most managers would say no. But in fact, this person was actually very important and has this kind of very interesting kind of pattern of editing these articles about the nuclear disaster. But so we could I could identify that he was very important editing the nuclear disaster articles. But I can put this in the context of like what the work that he was doing in his articles. I can look at the other work he was doing in these, here is actually implicated in the work that he was doing in these other places. So again, we got these light green, these light blues. So this was actually a person who on the Harry Potter article in particular, so like when a new book would come out, people would say, look, don't put the spoilers in. Like, like what if people want to read the Wikipedia article and they want to have the spoilers? Like, I don't know why you'd be reading the Wikipedia article. But so this is a person who basically did a lot of like arbitration, dispute resolution on the Harry Potter kind of space of articles about like how to kind of do policy enforcement and governance and consensus formation. So this person was basically able to sort of migrate that expertise about how to do consensus formation, dispute resolution into this new space about this kind of new and late-breaking kind of event. So we're able to kind of see this kind of migration of expertise between places. And he also kind of worked on another kind of cluster of things up here. Again, you've also might have, if you're a manager and someone came to you and said, oh, I really like Japanese serial killers and pop bands. Like, can I edit articles about nuclear disasters? Again, you might not say no, but again, you got all this blue here, and this is like pointing to the fact that this person actually is probably someone who is Japanese or lives in Japan or knows a lot about sort of Japanese geography and things like that. So the work that he was doing in the context of this case was actually updating all the information about sorts of the towns and cities and landmarks and geographic locations that were kind of wiped out by the geography. So it wasn't just the fact that we had to kind of create new knowledge and update our state of the knowledge on Wikipedia by creating one article. We actually had to go and revise other articles like the airports and baseball stadiums and small towns and villages that were also kind of wiped out. And so this person was doing a lot of that work. So here again, we see some sort of migrating to sort of local knowledge and this kind of particular weird communities into sort of this very important work around this breaking news event. And we could also imagine sort of stepping back and imagining, okay, well, we've got like people editing. We really looked at like one editor or one article. Like what would happen if we begin to sort of combine articles, right? So if we take this approach again, so the fact that like B edits after A on one article, but then on another article we see them interacting in this characteristic way again, right? We can sort of represent this as like a weighted edge, right? So they've interacted across two articles. Both of these articles happen to be these breaking news articles that were created within 24 hours of the event. So they're interacting, 100% of their interaction of these two interactions is on these breaking news articles. We might imagine two other editors, they edit on a breaking news article, a non-breaking news article is, it might be something else. And so we'll kind of like, again, give them weight too, but we'll kind of interpolate that color to like this green to show that they're working on like a mixture of breaking and non-breaking articles, right? And so we get this really interesting resulting graph again. So the nodes here are like users modifying each other's work, but these are people who are modifying each other's work across 3 or more articles. So they've interacted across 3 or more articles. And so again, you have these, the red here is people who've interacted exclusively on breaking news articles. These are the ambulance chasers. These are people who are moving from article to article as a sub-community and modifying each other's work across all these different kinds of articles. And so the fact that we're editing one after another is actually not evidence of us kind of fighting over the state of the article, of us actually kind of substantively, again, kind of accumulating and aggregating our work together and being mobile while doing that. These blue ones are kind of a little bit rare. These are people working on non-breaking articles. And then we've got this really interesting cluster of this green down here. And so what this is actually, so this points to us being to sort of identify this really interesting community of practice. And this community are people who edit articles about hurricanes. And so there's a sub-community of people on Wikipedia who edit articles about hurricanes. Hurricanes have historical hurricanes. They like to edit articles about hurricanes in 1932. They have templates and standards and sort of mechanisms for like editing articles about hurricanes. And so they think all hurricane articles should follow these templates, and they're really good templates. And so when a new hurricane happens, they go and start writing that article around those kinds of things as well. And so again, the fact that this green color reflects the fact that they're moving between sort of like working in the context of breaking news, which is my kind of side of study, but they're also kind of bringing in knowledge from these kinds of non-breaking contexts. So again, we got this kind of very particular and interesting community of practice who we were able to sort of surface these users and understand a very particular context that they're coming from, how they're kind of moving between these spaces of these breaking high tempo collaborations and these kind of more stable traditional collaborations. And so to this objection that, well, this approach doesn't really sort of capture us working together. We might be working on completely different parts of the article, and like that's certainly the case, but we also find that in practice, people are in fact working together and moving across these different articles in these kinds of ways, that we're sort of able to sort of collapse this really complex event log data into these networks and reveal these interesting anomalous structures. And that given these anomalies, we can begin to dive in and do some really fun kinds of qualitative and mixed methods inquiry. And these anomalous contribution patterns also, again, sort of document these kinds of emergent roles within these large-scale collaborations. And we can begin to sort of think about how can we like aggregate and combine these graphs and overlap them and look at how people are working together across multiple kinds of collaborations and how that might begin to sort of illuminate new kinds of social roles and communities that we would otherwise potentially miss. And so again, like I've argued that we need to pay attention to this accumulation of contributions, this non-randomness in the structure of these, how these kind of have these really fun and emergent properties, and how we can use this kind of quantitative approach to kind of distill down this really complex sequential event log data to kind of begin to do some really nice mixed methods inquiry. So again, one way that I've done this has been to look at this by looking at the sequence data and represent it as networks. We could certainly imagine doing other things like bringing in bioinformatics or kinds of operational research kinds of things as well. This is a collaboration on GitHub where we got the creator of this GitHub library is out here, and then long periods of time pass. No one kind of engages with like modifying this person's work, and then this kind of fourth editor comes along and then brings in this whole other community, or makes a contribution that brings in this whole other community of people, and engages with all these other community members in these blue colors that like very quickly, relative to these like redder colors, like longer periods of time. And this points to like the potential to begin to extract sorts of really nice kinds of quantitative data from these socio-technical systems. There's ways in which these systems are encoding really rich kinds of relational data about social processes that we need new ways of kind of bringing these things out to understand how it is that they're being built and accumulated and changing over time. And ultimately, this is like a story about like this an accumulative process. Like this accumulation process is a form of narration that is kind of documenting the change this artifact over time, and if we want to kind of take that seriously, we should sort of orient our methods to these accumulative processes and sort of how these systems are actually encoding and documenting narratives about how artifacts are changing over time, and that we can begin to sort of use quantitative methods to expose interesting regularities and patterns and social roles, but also anomalies and sorts of weird outliers to dive in and begin to understand boundary cases, and ultimately begin to think about how these kinds of non-traditional kinds of relationships can be aligned with other kinds of traditional relationships, like the fact that people are editing one after another. Can we combine that with the fact that people are communicating with each other on their talk pages or something like that? And it also kind of points to the need to develop other kinds of quantitative models to look at how queuing, so the fact that are we kind of like operating at some kind of characteristic kind of like clock rate, that do I work in a kind of characteristic frequency, or am I kind of responding to other kinds of people? It's a synchronization. Do we see sort of spillovers or contagion or peer effects that if I start editing a new article, do I start bringing other people in to edit that article because of my contributions there? So it's also kind of really exciting to think about how we can begin to bring in other generative and kind of statistical approaches to understand these kinds of processes as well. So thank you.
So I have a quick question for, one of the things you say is like you can't control who comes after me.
Yeah.
But it is something that you could, it's not a random thing, because if I go on Wikipedia and I change something in a way, that's going to generate other people. If I do something that's controversial, say something that's controversial, that's going to generate all sorts of responses, right? Just like the bot that's fixing the vandals. So my question, and I'm thinking from like from someone who doesn't do networks, but find this really interesting, is how do you get at the content of these changes? Like in such a such a big network, and such these things are happening all the time. Is there ways to actually say like, well, certain types of content produces these types of responses in any type of text network analysis?
Right. So you might imagine doing some sort of you could analyze like what do large contributions like then sort of invite people to come in and like kind of modify and kind of build on top of that versus kind of like the micro copy editing kinds of things. So you might imagine sort of looking at comparing like sort of larger contributions. Does that sort of invite people sort of build on top of those if I write a whole paragraph? Right. So we could begin to sort of like that would be like a really nice example of like these kinds of like an outlier. These people are outliers in some ways, and like are those then instruments to kind of get at sorts of causal mechanisms of how people then build collaborations around these kind of a new sentence or a new so these text level features.
So there's no other way really, besides actually going in there and reading and coding, besides like how much they're adding to sort of figure out what type of content is generated.
So Aaron Hafeker, who's at the Wikimedia Foundation, has these kind of very computationally intensive ways of sort of tracking like word level persistence, so that if I write like the cat is black and then someone comes in and says the cat is black and white, then you get the credit for the first 4 words, I get credit for like the next 2 words, but then how long does that persist and things like that. Those are but what happens if that sentence gets moved somewhere else? Do you keep that ownership? Does the person who moved that keep the ownership? You get into these really sticky questions. And so I chose not to engage with that and instead went down this weird rabbit hole. Like, what happened if you just adopted this really naive heuristic? Like, how far would that get you? Yeah, Jeff?
In kind of a related vein, I was wondering, do you know how the anti-vandal bot detects vandalism and how it distinguishes vandalism from legitimate?
Yeah, so there's this really fun and interesting ecosystem of people who write these anti-vandalism bots, and they adopt kinds of different heuristics around them. So they can be kind of like keyword-based sorts of things. They can be sort of behavioral. So if someone goes in and makes 1,000 changes in 1 minute, no human can do that, so it must be automated. So then it'll detect those kinds of patterns and undo that. If you're saying bad words, it'll try to undo that. If you're removing large blocks of text, it'll detect that and undo that. So there's And these are not sort of controlled or sanctioned by the Wikimedia Foundation, and so these are kind of just purely ecological, really, that sort of people have these kind of bots in the wild doing these kinds of micro-governance kinds of work, and they follow very different kinds of rules, but the effect is they offload a lot of that work to other people. And it's not just anti-vandalism, they also do kind of like copy editing things as well.
Yeah, I thought this was really great. And my concern was really about, I kind of want to have that GitHub graph, but for the Wikipedia page. And I feel like with this right now, you have, there's just a little bit too much noise, there's just too many roles, and you really kind of want a latent, one latent variable, which would be capture something like, is this person an editor, or is this person involved in some sort of ephemeral vandalism, something like that. And it seems like you have two really simple covariates that could tell you like what kind of person or activity is going on. I guess the person could change their role. They could be chastened by a vandalism correction bot and then become a real editor or something like that. But it seems like you have the distance between the edits. So did this edit happen within 10 seconds or a day or a month? And then you also have, is there any overlap between the edit? Like did the subsequent edit modify whatever the previous person modified? And it seems like with those two covariates, you could essentially have a simple latent variable model where you assume that the person, like the two people have some role, either A or B or.
Right. So I think what you're getting is like, can we actually sort of identify substantive links here rather than kinds of like, there's so certainly, right. So there's certainly like randomness still in this graph, right? So the fact that we're editing, like you want to make 3 edits, I want to make 3 edits, they happen to be at the same time, that might be interspersed or not, right? So there's certainly ways you might think about statistically conditioning some links over others, using some kinds of approaches, or kind of bringing in other kinds of latent data or metadata about the kinds of content or sort of the speed of that to kind of like sparsify this graph and identify kind of more substantive links, I think.
Just inferring it, so there's two unknown types, and like I don't know what a person is or what an edit is. If it's a substantive edit or whatever, a substantive sequence or a non-substantive. I guess you would attach it to the edge, right? Is this a substantive edge or a non-substantive edge?
Yeah.
Well, you wouldn't assume that. You would just say there's 2 edge types. Right. We don't know which one is. Just infer from the data.
Distribution.
Right, infer from the data. And you have uncertainty too. I think that would be really kind of rewarding.
It's really nice.
And maybe it would allow you to compare the GitHub kind of things to this, which right now I think is kind of not really possible since they're too different.
I mean, the goal would be that like we can apply these kinds of methods to all these different kinds of systems. I could do it to the GitHubs, we could do it to the Reddits, we could do it like the work that I do at HBS around sorts of people taking online courses. We can look at the sequence of people taking online courses and sort of represent that sequence as a graph. Do you move to taking econ after stats, and like so conditional on you taking some sequences, do you do better than other people who take other sequences? And so the goal here is to sort of begin to sort of illuminate how do people move through these systems, like the sequence of actions that people take through these systems, and how can we use those as a set of features on either side of the equation, right, as outcomes or as explanatory factors. So we've got these kind of nice behavioral features. Can we use network analysis approaches to kind of extract kind of nice, potentially orthogonal kinds of representations to predict like things we care about, like performance or things like that.
So I took a lot of notes. It was a great talk, and there are a couple of things that are rattling around in my mind that I kind of want to engage in. That I don't. Maybe you've looked at this. Or,
Sure.
First is that GitHub has made things public, right? When Raymond wrote about the Hero Bazaar, that wasn't really envisioned, as I recall. And Shirky was much more of a utopian about transparency and the publicness, and the way that Zuckerberg is. And it's like, it's great to be transparent if you're white and wealthy, and not so great if you're not, right? So it seems like there's an interesting test case to look at, say, GitHub repositories that are at large companies but private versus public GitHub repositories, and what the differences in their behavior in those two cases.
So Jen Tom, she's now at Amazon, but when she was a grad student at Cornell, like looked at this idea of territoriality in these collaborative systems, right? So this idea that we're ostensibly in an open collaboration. I've invested a lot of labor into this particular artifact. I don't want, there's ways in which I could behave to kind of dissuade people from sort of engaging in that. And so what do those performances look like? What are those strategies? How effective are they? So in Wikipedia, they call that, something like ownership. It has a sort of very kind of negative connotation, but you might imagine sort of a distributed software system that if you're very expert, this is kind of very important, like core kernel, like maybe you don't want people kind of like banging around and things like that. Certainly GitHub is also qualitatively different in that, people can, there might be a whole bunch of pull requests and like the event log might only look at the pull requests that you've approved, right? And versus Wikipedia, it's like just everything goes in, and then you've got this kind of issue of bots have to clean up like the bad stuff as well. And so there is that kind of like interesting difference between those as well. But I think this like idea of ownership, also kind of would manifest kind of structurally in these as well, that, like you would see these owners as like maybe these very central people, kind of like new people come in and like, I'm going to push you back out, kinds of things like that, or I'm kind of try to build upon your contribution as well.
So building on that, did you look at, there's a big difference between GitHub and Wikipedia in terms of what I'll call truth or factuality.
Sure.
Where like a bug fix is objectively more true than the code that made the bug. And there can be a unit test, and like that's just kind of like the earthquake article. On this date and time, it was 171 deaths, and on this date and time, it was 183 deaths. And those are factual changes. And the challenge with facts is that we think they're permanent, but they're always changing.
Right.
But in Wikipedia, there are factual articles and there are less factual articles. I'm wondering if you or anybody has looked at the difference in how those networks evolve. And I'm thinking in particular about the Wikipedia article on Gamergate, which I haven't looked at in about 6 months, but was extremely controversial. And it's a guy who runs Eastgate Software, long-term, 10, 15-year editor of Wikipedia, on the board, who really got shut down because he took a feminist position, if you will, that my understanding as of 6 months ago is that the Gamergate article on Wikipedia did not represent.
Had been captured by the sort of
exactly. Regulatory
yes.
capture is a good way, a good frame to look at it. So I'm wondering if you've looked at, like, you could imagine your rich attributes that you could do qualitative analysis, like sentiments and semantics on the words that people are using in a sort of non-factual article. Is anybody doing work like that?
So another way you might attack that is like, we could look at the coupling between these two different systems. We might have a discussion page where people interacting and bring up these kinds of issues, and we see like those interactions occurring in kind of a more discursive setting, and then we've got the kind of in the production sort of system, like those interactions occurring. Like, is there any kind of transfer there? Can we identify conflict in both kinds of contexts? Is kind of interesting. To the question of capture. I don't know that anyone's looked at that off the top of my head. I can follow up with you on that. What you will see, though, is that the articles about abortion or Israel-Palestine or global warming or any of these kinds of issues with George W. Bush will all have this kind of very characteristic, kind of like tightly clustered kind of pattern that will look kind of hairball-y like this. But the effect is that these articles actually end up and so if you're a scholar, like a rhetorician, like you might be very excited because you've got kind of like, if you're like a public sphere scholar, you got people kind of fighting over things, and that might lead to higher quality kinds of outcomes because these things are being negotiated and built upon. But there's certainly still these issues of capture, and you do see this. I know there's Benjamin Mako Hill is a open source collaborator who does some Wikipedia work as well, and he's written about how in the sorts of more marginal kinds of articles, not kind of these high stakes, highly central articles, you do see kind of like people who are wiki lawyering, basically people who are more willing to sort of engage and be committed or kind of demonstrate their commitment to kind of escalating these fights, or will end up sort of prevailing because given sort of limited labor hours among volunteers, the people who demonstrate sort of greater willingness to sort of escalate issues will end up sort of dominating these kinds of conversations. So I think in the case of Gamergate, you had sort of a community of people who are sort of demonstrating a willingness to kind of escalate and kind of have that kind of solidarity to kind of push back on people who are doing that. So if, you're coming in with a countervailing viewpoint, you don't have that kind of social capital to back you up as well, you're ultimately not going to prevail. And there's structural reasons why Wikipedia is going to be bad at gender coverage things generally, because it's 80% male.
Thanks. Up next we have James.